Chapter 10. Whose fault is it? Choice, disappointment, and depression. I have suggested that with limitless choice, we produce better results with our decisions than we would in a more limited world, but we feel worse about them. However, the stakes involved are considerably higher than just creating mild disappointment. Unlimited choice, I believe, can produce genuine suffering when the results of decisions about trivial things are important ones, about items of consumption or about jobs and relationships are disappointing. We ask why. And when we ask why, the answers we come up with frequently have us blaming ourselves. The American happiness quotient has been going gently but consistently downhill for more than a generation. While the American gross domestic product, a primary measure of prosperity, more than doubled in the last 30 years, the proportion of the population describing itself as very happy declined. The decline is about 5%. This might not seem like much, but 5% translates into about 14 million people. People who would have said in the 70s they were very happy would not say so today. The same pattern is present when respondents are asked more specific questions about how happy they are with their marriages, their jobs, their financial circumstances, and their places of residence. It seems that as American society grows wealthier and Americans become freer to pursue and do whatever they want, Americans get less and less happy. The most dramatic manifestation of this decrease in societal happiness is in the prevalence of clinical depression. At the opposite end of the happiness continuum, by some estimates, depression in the year 2000 was about 10 times as likely as depression in the year 1900. The symptoms of depression include loss of interest or pleasure in routine daily activities, including work and family, loss of energy, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness, guilt and self blame, indecisiveness, inability to concentrate on or think clearly, recurrent thoughts of death, including thoughts of suicide, insomnia, loss of interest in sex, loss of interest in food, sadness, feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, low self esteem. Aside from the obvious fact that victims of depression are miserable and unhappy, depression also takes a major toll on society in general. The friends, co workers, spouses, and children of depressed people suffer too. Children are less well cared for, friendships are neglected or abused, co workers must take up the slack from inadequate job performance. In addition, depressed people get sick more. Mildly depressed individuals miss 1.5 times as much work as non depressed, and severely depressed individuals miss 5 times as much. And depressed people die younger from a variety of causes, including heart disease. Suicide is, of course, the most extreme consequence of depression. Depressed people commit suicide at roughly 25 times the rate of non depressed people, and it is estimated that about 80% of suicidal people are significantly depressed. Clinical depression is a complex phenomenon that comes in several varieties and undoubtedly has multiple causes. As our understanding of depression improves, it may turn out that what we now regard as a single disorder will be viewed as a family of disorders with overlapping manifestations but distinct causes. So you should understand that the discussion of depression that follows will not capture the experience of every person who suffers from it, but certain themes have emerged that increase our overall understanding of the phenomenon. Learned helplessness, control, and depression. Earlier, we discussed Seligman and his colleagues' discovery of learned helplessness. They were conducting a series of experiments on basic learning processes in animals. The experiments required animals to jump over small hurdles to escape from avoid electric shocks to the feet. The animals typically learn this quickly and easily, but a group of animals that were exposed to the task after having experienced a series of unavoidable shocks failed to learn. Indeed, many of them failed even to try. They sat passively and took the shocks, never venturing over the hurdle at all. The explanation for this failure was that when the animals were being exposed to the uncontrollable shocks, they learned that they were helpless. Having learned this helplessness, the animals then transferred the lesson to the new situation, one in which they actually did have control. As the laboratory work on learned helplessness continued, Seligman was struck by a variety of parallels between helpless animals and people who are clinically depressed. Especially striking was the parallel between the passivity of helpless animals and the passivity of depressed people, who sometimes find trivial tasks like deciding what to wear in the morning overwhelming. Seligman speculated that at least some instances of clinical depression were the result of individuals having experienced one significant loss of control over their lives and then coming to believe that they were helpless, that they could expect this helplessness to persist into the future and to be present across a wide range of different circumstances. According to Seligman's hypothesis, therefore, having control is of crucial importance to psychological well being. The fundamental significance of having control was highlighted in a study of 3-month-old infants done more than 30 years ago. Infants in one group, those who had control, were placed face up in an ordinary crib with their heads on a pillow. Mounted on the crib was a translucent umbrella with figures of various animals dangling from springs and inside. These figures were not visible to the infants, but if the infants turned their heads on the pillows, a small light would go on behind the umbrella, making the dancing figures visible for a little while. Then the light would go off. When the infants did turn their heads just by chance and turned on the light and saw the dancing figures, they showed interest, delight, and excitement. They quickly learned to keep the figures visible by turning their heads, and they kept on doing so again and again. They also continued to show delight at the visual spectacle. Other infants in the study got a free ride. Whenever a control infant turned on the light behind the umbrella in its crib, that action also turned on the light behind the umbrella in the crib of another infant. So these other infants got to see the dancing figures just as often and for just as long as their controlling partners did. Initially, these infants showed just as much delight in the dancing figures, but their interest quickly waned. They adapted. The different reactions of the two groups caused researchers to conclude that it is not dancing toy animals that are an endless source of delight for infants, but rather having control. Infants kept smiling and cooing at the display because they seemed to know that they made it happen. I did this, isn't it great? And I can do it again whenever I want. The other infants, those who got the display for free, did not have this exhilarating experience of control. Young infants have little control over anything. They can't move their bodies towards things they want or away from things that are unpleasant. They don't have very good control over their hands, so that grasping and manipulating objects is not easy. They get poked, prodded, picked up, and put down at unpredictable and inexplicable times. The world is just a set of things that happen to them, leaving them completely at the mercy of others. It is perhaps for just this reason that the occasional bits of evidence that they can control certain things are so salient and so exciting. The significance of control to well being was also dramatically demonstrated by a study of people at the opposite end of the life cycle. One of group one group of nursing home residents was given instruction on the importance of being able to take responsibility for themselves in the home, and a second group was given instructions about how important it was for the staff to take good care of them. The first group was also given several mundane choices to make every day and a plant to take care of in their rooms, while members of the second group had no such choices and had their plants cared for by the staff. The nursing home residents given a small measure of control over their daily lives were more active and alert and reported a greater sense of well being than the residents without such control. Even more dramatically, the residents who had control lived several years longer on average than the residents who did not. Thus, from cradle to grave, having control over one's life matters. Helplessness, depression, and attributional style. Seligman's helplessness based theory of depression was not without problems. Chief among them was that not everyone who experiences a significant lack of control becomes depressed. So the theory was modified by Seligman and co-workers in 1978. The revised theory of helplessness and depression suggested that important psychological steps intervene between the experience of helplessness and depression. According to the new theory, when people experience a failure, a lack of control, they ask themselves why. Why did my partner end their relationship? Why didn't I get the job? Why did I fail to close the deal? Why did I blow the exam? In other words, people seek to understand the causes of their failures. What Seligman and his colleagues proposed was that when people are looking for causes of failure, they display a variety of predispositions to accept one type of cause or another, quite apart from what the actual cause of the failure might be. There are three key dimensions to these predispositions based on whether we view causes as being global or specific, chronic or transient, personal or universal. Suppose you apply for a job in marketing and customer relations but fail to get hired. You ask why. Here are some possible answers. Global. I don't look good on paper and I get nervous at interviews. I'd have trouble getting any job. Specific. I don't really know enough about the kinds of products they sell. To look good at an interview, I need more of a feel for the business. Chronic. I don't have a dynamic, take charge kind of personality. It's just not who I am. Transient. I had just recovered from the flu and had not been sleeping well. I wasn't at my best. Personal. The job was there for the taking. I just couldn't get it done. Universal. They probably already had an insider picked out. The job search was just for show, and no outsider would have gotten the job. Having failed to get the job and explain this failure to yourself in a specific, transient, and universal way, what will you expect at the next job interview? Well, if you look for a job in an area that you are more familiar with, if you have been sleeping well and are more energetic and alert, and if the search is really open, you'll do fine. In other words, your failure to get this job has almost no implications for how you'll do when you go after the next one. Imagine instead that you tend to identify global, chronic, and personal causes for your failures. If your resume is unimpressive and you choke at interviews, if you are a passive kind of person, and if you believe that the last job was really available for the right person, not you, then your expectations for the future are pretty bleak. Not only did you not get this job, but you're going to have trouble getting any job. The revised theory of helplessness and depression argued that helplessness induced by failure or lack of control leads to depression if a person's causal explanations for that failure are global, chronic, and personal. It is only then, after all, that people will have good reason to expect one failure to be followed by another, and another, and another. What's the point of getting out of bed, getting dressed, and trying again if the results are foreordained? Tests of this revised theory thus far have yielded impressive results. People do differ in the types of predispositions they display. Optimists explain successes with chronic, global, and personal causes and failures with transient, specific, and universal ones. Pessimists do the reverse. Optimists say things like, I got an A and she gave me a C. Pessimists say things like, I got a C and he gave me an A. And it is the pessimists who are candidates for depression. When these predispositions are assessed in people who are not depressed, the predispositions predict who will become depressed when failures occur. People who find chronic causes for failure expect failures to persist. Those who find transient causes don't. People who find global causes of failure expect failure to follow them into every area of life. Those who find specific causes don't. And people who find personal causes for failure suffer large losses in self esteem. Those who find universal causes don't. I am not suggesting that taking credit for every success and blaming the world for every failure is the recipe for a successful and happy life. There is much to be gained by arriving at causal explanations that are accurate, whatever the psychological cost, because it is accurate explanations that offer the best chance for producing better results the next time. Nonetheless, I think it is fair to say that for most people, the most of the time, excessive self blame has bad psychological consequences, and as we'll see, it is much easier to blame yourself for disappointing results in a world that provides unlimited choice than in a world in which options are limited. Helplessness, depression, and modern life. The American middle class now experiences control and personal autonomy to a degree unimaginable to people living in other times and places. Millions of Americans can live exactly the lives they choose, barely constrained by material, economic, or cultural limitations. They not they, not their parents, get to decide whether, when, and whom they marry. They, not their religious leaders, get to decide how they dress, and they, not their government, get to decide what they watch on television or read in the newspaper. This autonomy, coupled with the helplessness theory of depression, might suggest that clinical depression in the United States should be disappearing. Instead, we see explosive growth in disease, what Martin Seligman described as an epidemic. Furthermore, depression seems to attack its victims at a younger age now than in earlier eras. Current estimates are that as many as 7.5% of Americans have an episode of clinical depression before they are 14. This is twice the rate seen in young people only 10 years earlier. And the most extreme manifestation of depression, suicide, is also on the rise, and it too is happening younger. Suicide is the second leading cause of death after accidents among American high school and college students. In the past 35 years, the suicide rate among American college students has tripled. Throughout the developed world, suicide among adolescents and young adults is increasing dramatically. In a study comparing rates in 1990 to rates in the 1970s and 1980s, UNICEF found that the incidence of suicide tripled in France, more than doubled in Norway, doubled in Australia, and increased by 50% or more in Canada, England, and the US. Only in Japan and what was then West Germany did youth suicide go down. In an era of ever greater personal autonomy and control, what could account for this degree of personal misery? Rising expectations. First, I think increases in experience control over the years have been accompanied stride for stride by increases in expectations about control. The more we are allowed to be the masters of our fates, the more we expect ourselves to be. We should be able to find education that is stimulating and useful, work that is exciting, socially valuable, and remunerative, spouses who are sexually emotional and intellectually stimulating and also loyal and comforting. Our children are supposed to be beautiful, smart, affectionate, obedient, and independent, and everything we buy is supposed to be the best of its kind. With all the choice available, we should never have to settle for things that are just good enough. Emphasis on freedom of choice, together with the proliferation of possibilities that modern life affords, has, I believe, contributed to these unrealistic expectations. In the last chapter, we saw that the amount of pleasure and satisfaction we derive from experience has as much to do with how the experience relates to expectations as it does with the qualities of the experience itself. People on diets evaluate weight loss relative to expectations about weight loss. It feels great to find out you lost 10 pounds when you were expected to lose 5, but not when you were expected to lose 15. College students evaluate grades relative to expectations about grades. It feels great to get a B when you are expecting a C, but not when you are expecting an A. If I'm right about the expectations of modern Americans about the quality of their experiences, almost every experience people have nowadays will be perceived as a disappointment and thus regarded as a failure that could have been prevented with the right choice. Contrast this with societies in which marriages are arranged so people have little control over whom they marry, or societies in which educational opportunities are limited so people have little control over what they learn. The key fact about psychological life in societies in which you have little control over these aspects of life is that you also have little expectations of control. And because of this, I think lack of control does not lead to feelings of helplessness and depression. Rising individualism and self blame. Along with the pervasive rise in expectations, American culture has also become more individualistic than it was, perhaps as a byproduct of the desire to have control over every aspect of life, to be less individualistic, to tie oneself tightly into networks of family, friends, and community is to be bound to some degree by the needs of family, friends, and community. If our attachments to others are serious, we can't just do whatever we want. I think the single most difficult negotiation that faces young people who marry in today's America is the one in which their partners decide where their individual autonomy ends and marital obligation and responsibility take over. Our heightened individualism means that not only do we expect perfection in all things, but we expect to produce this perfection ourselves. When we inevitably fail, the culture of individualism biases us towards causal explanation that focus on personal rather than universal factors. That is, the culture has established a kind of officially acceptable style of causal explanation, and it is one that encourages the individual to blame himself for failure. And this is just the kind of causal explanation that promotes depression when we are faced with failure. As a corollary, the modern emphasis on individual autonomy and control may be neutralizing a crucial vaccine against depression. Deep commitment and belonging to a social groups and institutions, families, civic associations, faith communities, and the like. There is an inherent tension between being your own person or determining your own self and meaningful involvement in social groups. Significant social involvement requires subordinating the self. So the more we focus on ourselves, the more our connections to others weakens. In his book, Bowling Alone, political scientist Robert Putnam focused attention on the deterioration of social connection in contemporary life. And in this context, it is relevant that the incidence of depression among the Amish of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, is less than 20% of the national rate. The Amish are tightly knit traditional community, one in which social ties are extremely strong and life choices are rather meager. Do the Amish have less control over their lives than the rest of us? Undoubtedly, yes. Do they have less control than the rest of us compared to what they expect? I think not. How much do they suffer psychologically from the constraints imposed by community membership and its attendant responsibilities? My suspicion is that they suffer rather little. Viewed from within Amish society, where expectations about individual control and autonomy are very different than they are in mainstream America, community membership doesn't entail much in the way of personal sacrifice. For the Amish, the unease that the rest of us may feel at the prospect of significant communal obligation is largely absent. It's just the way things are for everybody. By elevating everyone's expectations about autonomy and control, mainstream American society has made deep community involvement much more costly than it would be otherwise. The distortions incumbent in the desire for control, autonomy, and perfection are nowhere more apparent than in the American obsession with appearance. The evidence is rather compelling that most of us can do little over the long term about our body shape and body weight. The combination of genes and early experience plays a major role in determining what we look like as adults, and virtually all diets tend to produce only short term changes. These facts about body weight are directly contradicted by what the culture tells us every day. Media and peer pressure tells us that obesity is a matter of choice, personal control and personal responsibility, and that we should aspire to look perfect, and that if we don't, we have only ourselves to blame. According to the culture, if we had enough discipline and self control, we could combine sensible eating habits and exercise regimes and all look like movie stars. That in a typical year, Americans buy more than 50 million diet books and spend more than $50 billion on dieting suggests that most Americans accept the view that what they look like is up to them. The illusion that each person can have the body that he or she wants is especially painful for women, and especially in societies like ours, in which the ideal body is extremely thin. Cultures that promote the ultra thin ideal for women, for example, Sweden, Great Britain, Czechoslovakia, and white America, have much higher rates of eating disorders, bulimia, and anorexia nervosa than cultures that do not. Even more significant for the present discussion is that in cultures that adopt the ultra thin ideal, the rate of depression in women is twice that in men. In cultures that adopt a more reasonable ideal, sex differences in rates of depression are smaller. The admittedly speculative connection between thinness and depression is this: body weight is something people are supposed to control, and to look perfect is to be thin. When efforts to be thin fail, people not only have to face the daily disappointment of looking in the mirror, they also must face the causal explanation that this failure to look perfect is their fault. Depression when only the best will do. Unattainable expectations plus a tendency to take intense personal responsibility for failure make a lethal combination. And as we have come by now to expect, this problem is especially acute for maximizers, as they do in regard to missed opportunities, regret, adaptation, and social comparison. Maximizers will suffer more from high expectations and self blame than will satisficers. Maximizers will put the most work into their decisions and have the highest expectations about the results of those decisions, and thus will be the most disappointed. The research that my colleagues and I have done suggests that, not surprisingly, maximizers are prime candidates for depression, with group after group of people varying in age, gender, educational level, geographical location, race, and socio-economic status. We have found a strong positive relation between maximizing and measures of depression. Among people who score highest on our maximization scale, scores on the standard measure of depression are in borderline clinical depression range. We find the same relation between maximizing and depression among young adolescents. High expectation and taking personal responsibility for failing to meet them can apply to educational decisions, career decisions, and marital decisions, just as they apply to decisions about where to eat. And even the trivial decisions add up if the experience of disappointment is relentless, if virtually every choice you make fails to live up to expectations and aspirations, and if you consistently take personal responsibility for the disappointments, then the trivial looms larger and larger, and the conclusion that you can't do anything right becomes devastating. The psychology of autonomy and the ecology of autonomy. Paradoxically, even at a time and place when excessive expectations of and aspirations for control are contributing to an epidemic of depression, those who feel that they have control are in better psychological shape than those who don't. To understand this, we need to make a distinction between what is good for the individual and what is good for the society as a whole, between the psychology of personal autonomy and the ecology of personal autonomy. In a study focused on 20 developed Western nations and Japan, Richard Eckersley notes that the factors that seem best correlated with national differences in youth suicide rates involve cultural attitudes toward personal freedom and control. Those nations whose citizens value personal freedom and control the most tend to have the highest suicide rates. Eckersley is quick to point out that these same values allow certain individuals within these cultures to thrive and prosper to an extraordinary degree. The problem is that on the national or ecological level, these same values have a pervasive toxic effect. The problem also may be exacerbated by what Robert Lane refers to as hedonic lag. Lane says that there is a tendency of every culture to persist in valuing the qualities that made it distinctively great long after they have lost their hedonic yield. This, he says, explains a lot of the malaise currently afflicting market democracies. The combination of hedonic lag with the mixture of psychological benefits and ecological costs of the culture's emphasis on autonomy and control makes it extremely difficult for a society to get things right. Clearly, our experience of choice as a burden rather than a privilege is not a simple phenomenon. Rather, it is the result of a complex interaction among many psychological processes that permeate our culture, including rising expectations, awareness of opportunity costs, aversion to trade offs, adaptation, regret, self blame, the tendency to engage in social comparisons, and maximizing. In the next chapter, we will review and amplify the recommendations we've made throughout the book, exploring what individuals can do despite societal pressure to overcome the overload of choice.